They laughed when the timber crew backed onto Ruth Calder's land and dumped rough oak slabs across her muddy farm road. The foreman called it cleanup. The driver called it offcut waste. One neighbor looked over the fence and said, "That woman is already one payment from losing the farm. Now she's got a pile of lumber nobody wants." But Ruth did not shout. She did not chase the truck. She did not call anyone to complain. She walked toward the heap of pale, bark-edged oak, knelt in the mud, brushed dirt from the grain, and whispered one word: tables. The men laughed harder, but before harvest season ended, those same slabs would become the tables that paid her overdue bills, filled her barn with orders, and kept the Calder farm from going to auction. Ruth Calder was 32 when the timber crew came. Her parents had both been gone within 4 years of each other, and the farm had become quieter than she could bear. Her mother's apron still hung behind the pantry door. Her father's clamps still lined the workshop wall. The old kitchen table still sat beneath the window, worn pale at the edges from years of elbows, coffee mugs, seed catalogs, and Sunday meals. That table was the heart of the house. When Ruth was little, neighbors came to that table after storms. Her mother served soup there when the roads washed out. Her father sharpened tools there when the barn was too cold. Birthdays, funerals, tax bills, broken fence plans, and harvest suppers all passed across that wood. Once, when Ruth asked why her father kept repairing the old table instead of buying a new one, he ran his hand across the scarred oak and said, "A good table is not built to be looked at. It is built to hold what people bring to it." Back then, Ruth thought he meant plates. Years later, she understood he meant life. But understanding did not pay the bills. The farm had survived drought, a broken hay baler, and 2 years of medical debt. Ruth had sold the last milk cow, taken fence work on neighboring farms, and rented out 10 acres just to cover taxes. The bank had given her until the end of summer. Everyone knew. Small towns do not need announcements. They read trouble in empty fields, parked equipment, in lights burning late in farmhouse kitchens. And Wade Mercer knew too. Wade ran a timber crew that had been cutting on the neighboring parcel. He was loud, broad, and careless. The kind of man who acted like a woman alone on land was a problem waiting to be pushed aside. His trucks had started using Ruth's lane to turn around. Then they started cutting the corner deeper. Then one morning, Ruth found mud ruts near her pasture gate and strips of bark scattered in the ditch. She drove down and told Wade to stay off her road. He smiled like she had asked permission to breathe. "You got more road than you got livestock," he said. Ruth kept her voice steady. "It is still my road." That was the part he did not like. 2 days later, she heard the truck before she saw it. The sound rolled over the pasture just after sunrise, heavy and grinding. Ruth was carrying a bucket of feed when the dump truck backed through the gate and stopped in the middle of her lane. The bed rose. Huge slabs slid out in a cracking, scraping rush. Oak hit the mud with a deep, heavy thud. Dust rose. Bark flew. One long slab landed across the road like a fallen bridge. Wade stood beside the truck with 2 crewmen grinning. "Saved you a trip to the lumberyard," he called. Ruth stared at the pile. "You dumped this on my land." Wade shrugged. "Looks like firewood to me." A neighbor, Carl Dobbs, had stopped by the fence with his arms crossed. "Ruth," he said, laughing, "you planning to build a dining room out of garbage?" The crewman laughed with him. Ruth said nothing. She walked closer. The slabs were filthy and uneven. Some had bark clinging to the sides. Some were split at the ends. They were too heavy to move easily and too large to ignore. But beneath the mud, Ruth saw grain, pale gold, long lines, thick live edges, Oak. Strong oak. The kind her father used to say could carry weight for 100 years if someone gave it time. She crouched and wiped the largest slab with her sleeve. The wood was rough, but it was not worthless. It was table stock. If you love stories where quiet people see value before everyone else does, subscribe to Rootmark. Because sometimes the people being laughed at are the only ones looking closely enough. Because sometimes the people being laughed at are the only ones looking closely enough. Wade expected Ruth to demand he haul the slabs away. Instead, she stood and said, "Leave them." He blinked. "What?" "You dumped them," Ruth said. "Leave them." Carl laughed from the fence. "You can't even move that mess." Ruth looked toward the old barn, then back at the oak. "No," she said softly. "Not all at once." That evening, after the truck left and the mud settled, Ruth came back with chains, wedges, gloves, a pry bar, and her father's old come-along. She could not lift the slabs, but she could shift them. Inches at a time, she dragged the smaller pieces toward the barn. She rolled one slab over with a fence post. She marked the best pieces with chalk. By dark, her shoulders burned. By midnight, she was too tired to untie her boots, but one pair of slabs lay under the open-sided shed, raised on blocks with air moving beneath them. The next morning, Carl came back. "You really keeping them?" Ruth slid thin strips of scrapwood between two boards. "They need to dry." Carl frowned. "They need a match." Ruth did not look up. "They need patience." Her father had taught her that oak could not be rushed. Too fast and it cracked. Too damp and it twisted. Too careless and the strength was wasted. So Ruth stacked the slabs with space between them. She weighted the top boards. She cut away rot. She sealed the ends. And every night after chores, she stood in the shed and studied the oak, like it might tell her what it wanted to become. The first table began with the widest 2 slabs. Ruth pulled them into her father's workshop with a chain and more stubbornness than strength. The shop smelled like old oil, dust, and pine shavings. Her father's clamps still hung in rows. His level sat on the bench. His pencil was still tucked in a jar beside rusted screws. Ruth had built shelves before. She had repaired gates. She had patched porch steps. But a farmhouse table was different. A table had to stand steady. A table had to invite people closer. A table had to hold. She cut the ends square. She sanded until her hands cramped. She followed the grain-filled small cracks and left the live edge where it still had shape and memory. The first coat of oil changed everything. The pale oak deepened. The grain rose in warm ribbons. The rough slabs Wade called waste began to look like something meant to gather people. When Ruth fastened the legs, the table wobbled. She tightened one bolt, shimmed one foot, checked it again. Then she stepped back. It was too heavy. It was not perfect, but it was honest, and it looked like it belonged in the farmhouse kitchen. She carried out the old table first. That nearly broke her. Her mother's table had been there so long the floor beneath it was lighter than the rest of the room. Ruth ran her hand over the old scars one last time, then moved it carefully against the wall. Then she brought in the new oak table. The room changed, not because it looked expensive, because it looked strong. 2 nights later, a storm took down power across half the county. Ruth still had a wood stove, oil lamps, and a pot of bean soup. When Carl's wife came by to check on her, Ruth invited her in. Then Carl came. Then another neighbor. Then 2 more. By 7 o'clock, 6 people sat around the table Wade had laughed at. Steam rose from bowls. Rain tapped the windows. Someone passed bread. For the first time in months, Ruth's kitchen sounded alive. Carl ran his palm across the table and went quiet. "Where'd you buy this?" his wife asked. Ruth looked down at the oak. I built it. Carl stopped chewing. From that dump pile. Ruth nodded. Nobody laughed. If you grew up around a kitchen table, a porch bench, or some old piece of furniture that held your family together, tell us about it in the comments. Sometimes wood remembers more than people think. The first order came the next morning. Carl's wife wanted a small table for their breakfast room. Then a teacher wanted a writing table. Then a young couple asked for a long dining table before their first baby came. Ruth built each one slowly. She did not know she was starting a business. At first, she was just trying to keep up. Mornings were for feeding animals and fixing fences. Afternoons were for cutting and sanding oak. Nights were for oiling tabletops under a single barn light. The barn began to change. The corner that once held broken seed bins became a drying rack. The wall beside the horse collars became a row of clamps. The old corn crib became storage for slabs. By spring, people were coming by appointment. They did not come because the tables were perfect. They came because the tables felt like they had already lived through something. A wedding venue ordered 2 long harvest tables. A church asked Ruth to build a memorial table for the fellowship hall. A grandmother wanted a table wide enough for every grandchild to sit at Christmas. That one made Ruth cry after the woman left, because she finally understood what she was selling. Not oak, not furniture. A place for people to come back to. By May, Ruth paid the overdue electric bill. By June, she caught up on the property taxes. By July, she made the farm payment the bank manager had quietly assumed would never come. He looked at the check, then at her rough hands. "Tables?" he asked. Ruth nodded. "From the wood dumped on your land?" "Yes." He leaned back, surprised. "That is one way to solve a problem." Ruth smiled faintly. It was one way to listen. But good news travels quickly. And men like Wade Mercer do not like hearing that something they threw away has become valuable in someone else's hands. He returned on a hot afternoon with dust on his boots and anger in his mouth. Ruth was sanding a tabletop when his truck stopped outside the barn. He stepped in without knocking. "I hear you've been selling my oak." Ruth turned off the sander. The barn went quiet. "Your oak?" she asked. Wade pointed toward the slab racks. Those were crew materials. Ruth wiped sawdust from her hands. They were dumped across my road. They were offcuts. You called them firewood. That doesn't mean you get to make money from them. Ruth walked to the workbench. She picked up the phone photo she had taken the morning of the dumping, the raised truck bed, the slabs sliding into the mud. Wade standing there laughing. Then she picked up the folded disposal note one crewman had dropped near the gate. Then the order book. Then the receipts. "You brought them here," she said. "You left them here. I moved them, dried them, cut them, sanded them, finished them, delivered them, and paid taxes on every table." Wade stared at the papers. Behind him, the barn was full of oak. Tables waiting for pickup. Benches with live edges. A long harvest table glowing in the center of the room. The wood he had called garbage now stood around him like witnesses. "You knew what they were worth," he muttered. Ruth looked at the table in front of her. "No," she said. "I knew what they could hold." That was when Carl stepped into the barn. He had come to pick up his wife's breakfast table, but stopped when he saw Wade. For once, Carl did not joke. He ran his hand over the finished oak and said, "Wade, you might have dumped the only useful thing your crew ever gave this town." Wade's face reddened, but he had no laugh left. If you are still rooting for Ruth, subscribe to Rootmark for more rural stories about land, legacy, quiet courage, and the truth people overlook. By late summer, Ruth painted a simple sign and hung it above the barn doors. Calder Oak Tables. She did not become rich overnight. Real farms do not work like that. There were still late nights, sore hands, warped boards, slow customers, and weeks when rain made everything harder. But there was steady work. There were deposits in the bank. There were orders booked into fall. And there was no auction notice on the farmhouse door. The day the final overdue payment cleared, Ruth came home just before sunset. The fields were gold. The barn doors were open. Inside, 3 finished tables waited beneath clean sheets. In the kitchen, the first oak table stood beneath the window, solid and quiet. Ruth sat down at it alone. For a moment, she heard her mother setting bowls down. She heard her father sharpening a knife at the far end. She heard rain, laughter, neighbors, grief, and grace. Then she placed both hands on the table and cried, not because she was broken, because the farm was still hers. Later that fall, Ruth built one more table from the largest slab Wade's crew had dumped. She did not sell that one. She placed it in the old barn for harvest suppers, customer meetings, and anyone who came by needing coffee and a chair. The first night she used it, Carl and his wife came. Then the teacher. Then the young couple with the baby. Then the grandmother with 3 of her grandchildren. They brought pies, bread, stew, and stories. The table held all of it. That was when Ruth finally understood her father's words completely. A good table is not built to be looked at. It is built to hold what people bring to it. The timber crew had dumped oak slabs on her land because they thought the wood was worthless and Ruth was too tired to do anything about it. But they were wrong about both. They saw slabs too heavy to move. Ruth saw tables strong enough to hold families. They saw waste. She saw work. They saw a woman nearly beaten. She saw one more thing her farm could still become. And in the end, the oak they dumped to shame her became the tables that fed her, the orders that carried her, and the reason the Calder farm stayed in the family. So if this story stayed with you, subscribe to Rootmark for more stories about rural truth, old wisdom, and the quiet strength people find in what others throw away.